Welcome to HCD's Mindset. I'm Michelle Nigella.
And I'm Kathryn Ambrose.
We are on a mission to help you identify what consumer science innovations have a lot of untapped value or are too good to be true.
So join us for more curious conversations as we try to make sense of the complex but fascinating world of human behavior. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in again for another wonderful episode that we have for you. Today, it's just going to be Michelle and myself. Michelle, how are you doing?
I'm all right. I've been ranting lately, though, and that's why we decided to have this conversation, right?
Yes, exactly. So I think it's important for us to just really hop right into it because we are in a little bit of a ranty mood. We apologize in advance, but we're hoping that it'll be helpful and, inspire some people to also go out and make your own rants about the same topic.
It's funny. So to start off, it's very, everything old is new again, right? Yeah. When I give presentations about the intro to applied neuroscience and consumer neuroscience, we always kind of talk about the history a little bit. And it is important to recognize the history because otherwise it repeats itself, and we always start off by talking about phrenology as the top example, right? So phrenology was where people were measuring bumps on the head to make predictions about how that person's personality was, or maybe if they were a criminal or if they would perform well in school. And of course, none of that's true, right? But it was scientific, it was measured, there was statistics, you got numbers. And so it seemed plausible at the time in the late 1800s. But obviously we know better now. We have better tools, or do we?
Yeah,
right?
I was like, that's the question. Do we have better tools?
So these tools have been in academia for a long time, whether it's EEG or even facial coding or fMRI or all these really cool ways to look at psychology and neuroscience and study humans and behavior. And they're all wonderful and really great. But at some point, somebody decided, right, that they wanted to take this very esoteric bit of knowledge that came from academia that was done maybe in a dish, right, of neuroscience, and wanted to extrapolate that and apply it to real world. So saying that, this very esoteric and very controlled study that was done in a lab at a university somehow can be interpreted for, predicting how someone's going to shop in a store, right? So like
it just doesn't
an
work
EEG study or fMRI on like images, somehow translates to how a package is going to perform. It's a huge leap, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we've shared things in the past about how overgeneralizing anything leads to really sexy titles, but really misinformed titles. And that is often what is really good clickbait for people to repost it, reshare it. And then once you have that fire started, it's really nearly impossible to stop it, especially if you do end up retracting it. That's still those reposts and everything, the word still got out on it and
pervades. It does. And why do we say everything old is new again? Well, when neuromarketing first came out, there was a lot of backlash because there was a lot of shoddy pseudoscience that happened. There were articles in The Guardian and in the New York Times and just really all over the place calling out the bad science, the overinterpretation. We mentioned it before, but that whole New York Times, I love my iPhone study that came out, and hundreds of neuroscientists signed a letter and published it in the Times saying this is incorrect, and yet it still pervades where people thinks that you can do fMRI and tell whether or not someone loves a product or will certainly buy it.
Right. And so during this episode, we really want to share a couple common neuro-myths that we have seen in the field. Michelle has been in the field for a bit of time now. I've been in the field I've been in the field for about 4 years. And even within my 4+ years, I've seen a shift, and it's like Michelle said, what's old is new. When I first started, I was like, oh, we're really making strides in shifting this narrative, and people are becoming more informed. Consumers are becoming more informed. But even with that said, people are going to keep perpetuating misinformation. So
there's a couple of lines in that I think are really key to remember. So when we say everything old is new again, it's because we call it neuro-Whac-A-Mole, right?
Yes.
So it's this idea that, this misinformation pops up and we try to smack it down. But then another one pops up, and then next thing you know, they're just popping up all over the place. So even though, back in 2010 or 2013, there was backlash against neuromarketing. Well, they just changed their name, right? Mm-hmm. Neuromarketing changed to become System 1. And that was the new, mole that popped up, and you try to whack it down. And it was like, okay, it's not just the Church of Kahneman. Oh, we're behavioral sciences. And now the same things that we're talked about under neuromarketing are starting to be talked about in behavioral sciences. And it's concerning. I mean, just recently, we've suddenly seen a resurgence of people talking about reading minds using fMRI for food research. Yeah. We reviewed a scientific article recently to be published in a paper that was using the term neuromarketing again, and relying very heavily on a lot of those misconceptions. Yeah. I was on a panel recently at a conference, and some of these neuro-hyped messages that we're going to address started coming up again. So everything old is new again. It's neuro-Whac-A-Mole. These things pop up again every few years. And so there's just certain things that I think everybody should hear us discuss, some points, so we're all on the same page. We can learn from history.
And I think it's also, before we really dive deep into all these different myths that we want to address, I do feel like it's important for us to recognize that neuromarketing, whatever you want to call it, System 1, all the tools that are involved in it and that are constantly or frequently used within this field are not based from neuromarketing, because neuromarketing is a interdisciplinary field. So it pulls from all these other areas. And I think that that's something important to bring up, because even in that article that we had explored, people were citing certain types of tools specifically as neuromarketing tools. But yes, but that's not where they originated. Just like phrenology is not a neuromarketing tool, it was a way to try to measure things.
Yeah. And EEG is not a neuromarketing tool. It is a psychological neuroscience, even computer science tool. Like it is just it's a hammer. Yeah. It's a hammer. You can use it in lots of different situations.
Yeah. So let's hop right into it and try to debunk some of these neuro myths. Michelle, what's the first one on the docket we want to talk about?
The first thing to talk about is the idea that you can be controlled, right? That there is some sort of like buy button in your brain that, if designers use neuroscience and psychology, that they can force you to do something you wouldn't have already done. So there's a fear, right, about sort of the ethics of using neuroscience and psychology in research, because you could be forcing someone. And so let's just set this up straight. Is there a buy button, Kathryn?
No. Very quite simply, no.
Yeah, we're complicated beings. The brain is very complicated. It kind of gets back again, things being new again. It's like subliminal messages, right? So the idea that there was, if you put messages in music that you could force people to murder their family or something, like it's
you
just
have
not
free will. Well, I believe you have free will. Most people, no matter what you do, your choices are your own choices. And so, yes, people can be biased in certain ways. So when we're talking about misinformation and algorithms, there is research showing that if you are shown specific types of things from an algorithm, it can further somebody's ideologies. Like that's not what we're talking about here. What we're saying is that just because a person puts a certain type of image or something in the background of a movie, you're not going to be that much more inclined to go and purchase it. It's a very fine line between that. But when people go searching for that buy button, you're not going to find it. It really is based more so on many other factors. It's not a one silver bullet. Right. It's the relationship.
It's not a magic button. It's not a magic color. It's not a magic fragrance, right? Now, all these things can act as cues, right?
Yes.
That sort of trigger you to remind you of something, right? So are there messages that can be put out there that remind you that you need to pick up something at the grocery store? And then while you're at the store, something attracts you and you end up buying it. Maybe it wasn't on your list, but it didn't force you to buy it, right?
That's the main thing, is control. You have control.
Yeah.
It's not any marketer. It's not any scientist.
Yeah.
You are the person that has control over your own choices.
And speaking of choices, another neuromyth is about decision-making. So, and it's very interesting because someone brought this up again at a conference we were just at, Kathryn and I. I was on a panel and one of the other speakers actually said this line, that 90% of all decision-making is non-conscious. And it is something that just won't die, right?
Yeah.
And there's so many ways you can unpack it as being untrue. But the first question I would have for anybody who says that 90% of all decision-making is non-conscious is, all right, where's the study, right? Because saying a number, 90%, implies that there was some sort of research that was done that, was able to signify like, this is an actual quantitative amount, right? 90%. So that's the first question. But then the second question is that, well, what did they use to decide something was conscious versus non-conscious? Because there is no way to do that.
Right. We always say that consciousness is a spectrum. It's not a switch that you just flip on or flip off. It's not black and white. It's very much a shade of gray. If you think about different states of consciousness, you can consider something like meditation is very different from sleeping, which is different than watching television. All of these are different states of consciousness. And so when we hear something like that, and honestly, this is applicable not just to this crazy 90% of your, decisions are made not consciously, but any statistical fact that you hear, cite your sources, show me the data, show me what got you to this. Because even when we spoke to Alex back about that statistics episode, he said, if you play with the data enough, you can torture it and it will confess to anything. Yeah. So that's really important to consider when hearing numbers. Sometimes numbers can be misleading.
And that one in particular is misleading. And I think it sort of plays into what people already think, because there's other neuromyths that sort of match it, right? The idea that we only use 10% of our brain. So 10 and 90, Lucy. Right? Oh, it adds up to 100.
Right.
And like movies like Lucy and, so it fits into this schema that we've all been sort of trained to believe are true, but you don't only use 10% of your brain. You have to use all of your brain to survive, right? Because most of your brain is actually just keeping you alive. It's not making decisions. So 90% of all decision makings being non-conscious just doesn't make sense. And when you actually dig into the history of it, and there is a history, right? It's falsified. So if you'd like to contact me about it, I'm happy to talk about the details of it. But if you can actually trace it back to a particular person that made up the number. But there is no article, because there can be no study, because it, as a construct, non-consciousness is not something you can measure. I think where the mistake gets made is that people divide tools into what they think are non-conscious tools and conscious tools, implicit versus explicit, id versus ego and super ego.
Yeah, even voluntary versus involuntary. It's things like that that really drive people. Everyone's trying to bucket things. And but it's not. It's a gray area, because, okay, let's take EEG, which people would assume is non-conscious activity. Not true. It's measuring all activity. And most of your non-conscious activity is really just the activity that's keeping your heart going or your eyes blinking, right? I would even go as far to say, and we can dive into this. This is another one of our neuromyths, but it's also not a lie detector. And people have been able to, beat the lie detector because you relax. You can have some control over your physiological state. And so that's not, and we use biometrics all the time in studies. We're not saying that it isn't a valuable tool. It just, you have to be able to design the research appropriately to make sure that you are using it correctly and that you're accounting for all these different variabilities.
And when there are these very obvious misunderstandings about the tools, and you really start to wonder about the people who are using them, because if they don't understand, if they're selling it as, EEG or, GSR any of these things are non-conscious tools, I get really upset as someone who, has been studying neuroscience and psychology, because they also measure explicit and conscious activity.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were saying, Kathryn, you can relax yourself and fool the lie detector test. So what we typically think of in a movie where someone's wired up for the lie detection, it's usually GSR and heart rate.
Right. And it's fun. I mean, I am just like everybody else who watches lie detector interviews sometimes, where I'll see celebrities go and get hooked up and they'll answer all these questions that everyone's curious about.
Yeah, we see the spike.
You're right. Right. Exactly. And you see the spike and they say, oh, you're lying. And it's fun. It's exciting to hear about. But the truth is, that person has a camera right in front of them. They know they're being filmed, and it's entertaining, and that's okay that it's entertaining, but it shouldn't be somebody's ride or die way of finding out information.
And it's interesting because if you actually look at the research, I believe it actually points to heart rate and skin conductance as not being very good indicators of lying, but that pupil dilation is better.
I've heard that as well. Yeah. So,
but the problem with that, of course, is that pupil dilation is also affected by all sorts of other things. So it can be non-discriminate.
Right. At the very basic level, consider if, for anyone that is curious about pupil dilation, your eye is really reacting to how much light it's being exposed to. That's why you can.
So if they're looking at a screen, right?
And also different types of medication, there's so many different things that are going to affect your pupils and your gaze behavior. But Michelle,
another thing. Another neuromyth
enough. Yeah.
Neuromyth number 4. So we've so far done, there's no buy button. Decision making is not 90% non-conscious. These tools are not lie detectors, number 3. And number 4 is that you're not reading minds. We're not peering into the brain. Mm-hmm. So if you're using EEG, you're looking at activity across the scalp. fMRI, okay, technically you are looking into the brain, right? You're doing what's called neuroimaging. But it's more complicated that you're not reading minds. We can't read minds, right?
Right. Absolutely. And think about what your mind and what your experiences are comprised of. There are so many nuances and things that make you have whatever goes on in your noggin between your two ears occur. And that is what is so exciting about neuroscience. We are getting much closer to understanding neuroimaging, but it's not replacing, and it's not saying that we actually can read the mind.
And maybe this is like a philosophical question, but I mean, do you think that at some point with advancing technology that we're going to be able to read minds? I mean, honestly, I have my answer, but I'm wondering about yours.
I honestly do not believe that's going to be something that's feasible. Like I said
I don't
before,
think so either.
Yeah, I think that the brain is too nuanced. And I also believe that, you have so much control over, and my background in, my undergrad years was focusing specifically on memory. I have very strong beliefs that your memory is a big part of how you shape how you live your everyday life and how you build your associations. And that can change based on how you recall whatever that memory is. So even the memory itself is not stagnant. It is constantly in flux and changing every time you recall it. So with all those things being said, I don't believe that there's ever going to be a tool that's going to be able to read it. And I also believe that you need to have the explicit expression of whatever the person is trying to share in order to fully encapsulate what is going on.
Technology is getting amazing, right? I mean, we have AI that, that can learn and understand better, seek patterns, right? And I think that's wonderful, but I don't think it's going to get to the point of where humans are with their brains. I mean, here we have, I talk about it this way all the time, but it's 3 pounds of fatty flesh in your skull. Right. And this 3 pounds has, 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections. And all of that is just mostly keeping you alive, but it's also like doing all these other amazing things, which I just don't think a computer is going to be capable of. Because when you look at the data, when you look at the research that's been done, the closest that we've come to reading a mind is where let's say I take Kathryn and I show her a video, a 10-second video, and I show it to her 100 times. And every time I show it to her, I record her brain activity with fMRI. So she's been in this fMRI machine for like a year, because And I just
having
keep
a great time.
and I read, and I now know what the pattern looks like in the fMRI data when she watches this video. So now if I give her a clutter reel of 10 videos, I might be able to pinpoint the moment that she was watching the video that I trained her on.
Right.
But there's a couple of keywords in there. Trained. I trained her mind to react a certain way by showing it to her like 100 times, right? I trained the fMRI data because it is just a set of numbers. It's not actual images. Right. I trained that to look a certain way. And I matched the two in that clutter reel, but not 100%. Yeah. Right. So even that isn't a direct match. It might only be like 70 to 80% of the time. And that's real studies that's actually been done in academic literature. So that's the closest we can get.
Right. And I think it's important for people to remember that, especially talking about that study, that a prediction is still just a probability. Yeah. There is no way that you will have something in certainty. That's not how science works. That's why we have confidence intervals. That's why we account for things like this and variability, because nothing is concrete. It's non-existent.
And that's a good segue into number 5. I think we're at now. So like 5 is an interesting one because, as far as like probability and predicting, it's interesting. Some people will tell you that neuro and biometrics and psychology can tell you everything, right? And I word this sometimes that, a widget salesman's only going to sell you a widget. They're not going to tell you that you should just ask in a survey, right? They're going to tell you, no, you have to do EEG or whatever tool it is that they have, whatever their widget is. But then there's like the other side where some people will say it tells you nothing. Mm-hmm. And we just encountered this recently where, a client came to us that we've been working with for years. And they heard from, one of their other suppliers that, all these tools do nothing and they can't be trusted. Well, we know that's not true. I mean, the wealth of data that there is for all of these measures, whether it's EEG or fMRI or heart rate, I mean, there's lots of support out there to show that they do measure what we intend, but it all boils down to how you use the tool.
Yes, absolutely. How you use the tool, how you design your study, and how you decide to interpret the study as well. Yeah. All of those things are going to influence how impactful using these tools are going to be for your business decisions or your product development strategies, XYZ. It's really a recognition. And also you want to consider things. We always say this in context. So you want to be able to pair tools together and recognize there is, like I said before, no silver bullet. Yeah. You can't trust one thing. All these tools come from various different disciplines and are applied in various different ways because they're a tool. A hammer can be used a million different ways. And I think
but it also has limitations, right?
Exactly.
So a hammer isn't going to be really good for like, scooping food out of a pan. You probably use a hammer,
Exactly.
So like,
I'm not going to eat my soup with a hammer.
No, right. So like or it's not also going to screw in a screw.
Right.
Exactly. So like it's just really important to think about what the tool is actually being used for, that they do have limitations, but they also have very specific purposes that can be used very well. Right. Yeah,
absolutely. And
I think, again, that leads us up into number 6, which is does it replace liking or asking? Right. So like, and it's so funny because this is, again, one of those misconceptions that I think we deal with all the time, with clients or people that are interested in this type of work. They immediately want to compare the results to explicit. I think with the idea that you are looking to replace, so a survey, for example. So it's thinking, okay, I have EEG. Can I just replace the survey with measuring someone's brain?
Right. No. So I said right because I'm listening, but I'm trying to clarify. No, you should never replace it. And the truth is, even if you have conflicting or contradicting results, that's exciting. That means that there is a disconnect there between what somebody's perceiving or sharing with you versus the way that their body is responding to it or the way that their physiology is responding.
It's really telling you something more. Yeah. So, again, with the idea that they're not lying, right? You're not trying to detect that they're lying, but someone can say that they like something. So let's say it's a scale from 0 to 7 and they give it a 6. They report they like this product or they like this ad. Could they have some negative experiences that happen, say, like while watching an ad and we're measuring them with EEG or whatever it might be, and they have some dips? Yes. Overall, they liked the ad, but here's some points at which maybe we can make some tweaks. Right. Or, is there something about the food experience or the packaging experience that is causing some negative reaction? Absolutely. We are complicated people. We are not one-dimensional. Emotions that we experience are typically not one-dimensional, so we can experience love and hate at the same time. Yeah. We can be angry and calm, which can be a very frightening kind of anger. So like these things can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a whole other can of worms for another episode to talk about the complexities of emotions. But when people are really trying to boil emotions down to just numbers and figures without accounting for the human component of it, you're really doing a disservice to understanding that experience. Yeah. Because somebody's perception is really crucial to trying to get the all-encompassing idea of what is happening. So that's always really important to keep in mind. If anybody has any questions about what we covered today, I know there was a lot in here. I am more than happy to chat with you. Michelle, I know, would be more than happy to chat with you as well. I want to make sure that we have some time for our game, but more than anything, if you see something that is really outlandish or seems really extreme, most likely it is, and people are trying to clickbait you, or they're just trying to get you to look into the article, because scientists, as we've talked about before, scientists are storytellers, and sometimes some are better than others at depicting the story. So with all that being said, Michelle, are you ready to play a fun game of free association?
Sure. We've been ranting on all this, so hopefully I can keep my emotions under control. Under control, right? I control me.
There you go. All right. So the first one will start off easy, something like trends.
Bad.
Misinformation.
Prevalent.
LinkedIn posts.
This one's interesting. I feel like they've gotten less professional. That's what I'll say. I
agree. Facial coding.
Ugh. Is that a response? Can that be a response?
I'll accept it. Buy button.
None.
Neuro-myths.
Prevalent.
Change.
Inevitable.
Mind reading.
Not possible.
And finally, carnival games.
Balloons.
And the reason that was just a little ode to our neuro Whac-A-Mole that we tend to call this. So if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. If you know somebody that might be sharing posts that are a little bit questionable, share it with them, share it with a colleague. We want to spread
Share it with us. I would like to see these questionable podcasts or posts. Let us know. Let's discuss it. Have you heard a neuro-myth?
Yeah.
Comment below with it.
Yeah, please. Awesome. All right. Until next time, everybody, take care and stay curious.
Thanks.
For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at HCD Research Inc. and at HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you, and stay tuned for more curious conversations.